Ruthless bikers laugh at a shy teen. Seconds later, they're begging for forgiveness. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over a desolate stretch of desert road. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of wind and the faint hum of engines in the distance. Ethan trudged along the dusty path, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His worn sneakers kicked up small puffs of dust with each step. He kept his head down, his shoulders hunched as though trying to disappear into the landscape. Ethan wasn't much to look at, skinny, with messy hair that seemed to defy any attempt at taming, and a faded t-shirt that hung loosely on his frame. His hands clutched the straps of his backpack, his knuckles pale with tension. He had always been the quiet one, the kid who avoided confrontation and slipped unnoticed through the cracks. But today, he couldn't avoid the path that stretched before him. In the distance, the faint rumble of engines grew louder, the sound cutting through the stillness of the desert. Ethan stopped, glancing over his shoulder. A group of motorcycles roared into view, their chrome frames glinting in the sunlight. As they approached, the riders slowed, their laughter carrying on the wind. The gang was a sight to behold, leather jackets, bandanas, and tattoos covering their sun-weathered skin. They exuded a rough, unapproachable energy, the kind that made people cross the street to avoid them. At the head of the pack was Rocco, the leader, his face marked by a deep scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He cut the engine and rolled to a stop, his sharp eyes locking onto Ethan. "Hey kid." Rocco's voice was gravelly, roughened by years of shouting over roaring engines and packs of men. The rest of the gang followed suit, forming a loose circle around Ethan. Their bikes idled loudly, the noise drowning out any hope of silence. Ethan froze, his fingers tightening on his backpack straps. He glanced around, searching for a way out, but the bikers had him surrounded. He took a hesitant step back, his throat dry. "Looks like we've got ourselves a lost little lamb," one of the bikers jeered, his grin wide and toothy. The others chuckled, their laughter rough and mocking. "What are you doing out here, huh?" Rocco pressed, leaning forward on his bike. "This ain't exactly the kind of place for a kid like you." Ethan didn't answer. He stared at the ground, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced, searching for a response, but nothing came. The bikers took his silence as weakness, their laughter growing louder. "Cat got your tongue?" Another biker sneered, revving his engine for effect. "Maybe he's just scared, huh?" "Yeah," Rocco said, his voice dripping with condescension. "What's the matter, kid? You afraid of us?" Ethan swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he finally spoke. "I'm just passing through. I don't want any trouble." The bikers erupted into laughter, the sound echoing across the empty desert. "You hear that, boys? He doesn't want any trouble." Rocco mocked, his grin widening. "Well, isn't that just adorable?" Ethan's cheeks burned, but he kept his gaze fixed on the ground. He knew better than to provoke them. He just had to wait it out, to let their amusement run its course. But the circle of bikes felt smaller now, the air thick with tension. "Come in, kid," Rocco said, dismounting his bike and walking toward Ethan. "We're just having a little fun. Lighten up." The gang fell silent as Rocco stopped in front of Ethan, towering over him. He reached out and flicked the strap of Ethan's backpack. "What's in here, huh? Work? Snacks for mommy and daddy?" Ethan took a step back, clutching the backpack tightly. "It's just my stuff," he said quietly. "Let's see it, then," Rocco said, his grin fading into something more menacing. He grabbed for the bag, but Ethan pulled it away, his movements quick and desperate. "Don't," Ethan said, his voice firmer now. "Just leave me alone." The bikers paused, their laughter replaced by murmurs of curiosity. Rocco narrowed his eyes, his amusement giving way to irritation. "You've got some guts, kid. I'll give you that." The group leaned forward, their attention focused entirely on Ethan. The tension was thick, the kind that made the air feel heavy and hard to breathe. Rocco took another step closer, his hand resting on the handlebars of a nearby bike. "You really think you're in a position to tell us what to do?" Rocco asked, his tone low and dangerous. "Out here, it's our rules." Ethan took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "I'm warning you," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Leave me alone." The bikers exchanged glances, their amusement returning in waves. "Warning us? "Oh, this is rich," one of them said, slapping his knee. But as the laughter continued, one of the older bikers, a grizzled man with a weathered face, stopped short. His eyes widened as he looked at Ethan, recognition dawning on his face. "Wait a second," the man muttered, his voice barely audible over the noise. He leaned forward, studying Ethan more closely. "Rocco, I think we've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" Rocco snapped, glancing back at the man. "That kid," the older biker said, his voice trembling slightly. "I've seen him before." Rocco turned back to Ethan, his brow furrowed. "What's he talking about? Who are you?" Ethan didn't answer. He stood his ground, his gaze steady now. The trembling in his hands was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable determination. "Who are you?" Rocco demanded again, his voice rising. Ethan met his gaze, his voice calm and deliberate. "I'm the son of someone you don't want to mess with." The bikers fell silent, their mocking smiles replaced by confusion. The air seemed to shift, heavy with an unspoken tension. Rocco narrowed his eyes, studying Ethan with a mix of irritation and curiosity. "Son of someone we don't want to mess with?" Rocco repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "What's that supposed to mean, kid? You think dropping some cryptic line is going to scare us off?" The older biker, the one who had recognized Ethan, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Rocco," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I think the kid's serious. I've heard of him." Rocco shot him a sharp look. "Heard of him? He's just some scrawny kid walking through our turf. What could you possibly have heard?" The older biker hesitated, his weathered face pale. "His dad. He's not just anybody." Ethan remained silent, his calm gaze fixed on Rocco. The leader of the gang frowned, glancing back at his men. The murmurs of doubt began to ripple through the group. It wasn't like them to second-guess themselves, but the older biker's reaction was enough to plant the seed of unease. Rocco leaned in closer to Ethan, his face inches away. "All right, kid. You've got my attention. Who's your old man, huh? Some local sheriff? A hotshot lawyer? Spit it out." Ethan took a slow breath, his voice steady. "My father is Grant Callahan." The name landed like a thunderclap. Several of the bikers exchanged wide-eyed looks, their bravado cracking under the weight of recognition. Even Rocco, for all his tough exterior, froze for a moment before straightening up. "Grant Callahan?" Rocco said, his voice quieter now. "The Grant Callahan? The one who—" "Yes," Ethan interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The one who dismantled 3 biker gangs and sent their leaders to prison. The one who knows every move you make before you even think to make it." The bikers shifted uneasily, their bravado unraveling. Rocco's jaw tightened as he processed the information, but he wasn't ready to back down. "That's a hell of a story, kid," he said, forcing a smirk. "But you don't look much like the son of some big-shot enforcer. You're just a scared little kid with a big mouth." Ethan's expression didn't waver. "You think I'm bluffing? Call him. Ask him yourself." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. None of them reached for their phones. The older biker, still pale, muttered, "We don't need to call him, Rocco. If this kid's telling the truth, we're in deep." "Shut it," Rocco snapped, though his voice lacked its usual force. He turned back to Ethan, his mind racing. "All right, let's say you're telling the truth. What are you doing out here all alone? Why aren't you hiding behind your daddy?" Ethan's gaze hardened, his voice calm but cutting. "Because I don't need him to deal with people like you." The bikers flinched at the words. The boy they had mocked moments ago now stood taller, his quiet confidence unsettling them in a way they didn't fully understand. "Rocco," the older biker whispered again, desperation in his tone. "We need to back off. If Grant Callahan gets wind of this—" "I said shut it." Rocco barked, though his voice cracked slightly. He turned to Ethan, trying to regain control of the situation. "All right, kid. Let's say we believe you. What do you want from us? An apology? A handshake? What?" Ethan stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The bikers instinctively parted, giving him space, their fear now palpable. He stopped in front of Rocco, his calm gaze meeting the leaders. "I don't want anything from you," Ethan said quietly. "But if you ever cross my path again, If you ever treat someone else the way you treated me today, you'll wish you hadn't? Rocco stared at him, the words sinking in like cold steel. He opened his mouth to retort but found himself at a loss. The weight of Ethan's calm authority was suffocating, and for the first time in years, Rocco felt small. Ethan turned, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. He walked past the stunned bikers, the group parting like the Red Sea to let him through. No one said a word, their pride crushed under the weight of their own fear and shame. As Ethan disappeared into the horizon, Rocco finally found his voice. "Let's go," he muttered, climbing back onto his bike. "We're done here." The bikers followed, their engines roaring back to life. But as they rode away, the weight of their encounter with Ethan lingered. None of them would forget the quiet strength of the boy who had turned their world upside down. The gang rode in silence, their bikes rumbling down the desolate road as the sun dipped closer to the horizon. Rocco's knuckles were white as he gripped the handlebars, his mind replaying the encounter with Ethan. The boy's calm demeanor, his steady gaze, it all gnawed at him. He had faced plenty of tough guys in his life, men twice his size and brimming with bravado. But Ethan? He was different. He wasn't loud or aggressive. He didn't need to be. Rocco glanced at his rearview mirror, catching the uneasy expressions of his crew. Their usual swagger had evaporated, replaced by quiet tension. Even the older biker, Pete, looked pale, his hands trembling slightly as he steered his bike. When they finally pulled off the road and stopped at a small diner on the edge of town, the bikers dismounted in silence. They shuffled inside, their boots heavy against the tiled floor. The smell of frying oil and coffee filled the air, but no one seemed hungry. They took a corner booth, the atmosphere between them heavy with unspoken fear. Pete broke the silence first. "We messed up, Rocco," he said, his voice low. "Big time." Rocco shot him a glare, but it lacked its usual bite. "We don't even know if that kid was telling the truth." Pete leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Do you really want to take that chance? Do you want to risk Grant Callahan finding out about this?" One of the younger bikers, a wiry guy named Tony, shifted uncomfortably. "Who the hell is this Grant Callahan, anyway? Why are we so scared of him?" Pete sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Grant Callahan isn't just some guy, Tony. He's a legend. Back in the day, he took down 3 of the biggest biker gangs in the state. He didn't just arrest them, he dismantled their entire operations. Businesses, hideouts, everything. The man's like a ghost. He knows things he shouldn't, and he strikes before you even see him coming." Tony frowned, his bravado faltering. "But the kid, he's just a kid. A kid with Callahan's blood," Pete snapped. "That makes him more dangerous than any of us." The table fell silent again, the weight of Pete's words settling over them like a storm cloud. Even Rocco, who prided himself on being fearless, couldn't shake the unease clawing at his chest. "What do we do?" another biker asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Pete looked at Rocco, his expression grave. "We apologize." "Properly." Rocco's jaw tightened. The idea of groveling didn't sit well with him, but deep down he knew Pete was right. "And if the kid doesn't accept it?" he asked. "Then we pray Callahan doesn't come for us," Pete said grimly. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his journey, the bikers' jeers and laughter already fading into a distant memory. He kept his pace steady, his mind calm. He didn't relish what had happened, but he wasn't sorry for standing his ground. Over the years, his father had taught him that strength wasn't about how loud you were or how much damage you could do. It was about knowing when to act and when to walk away. Ethan paused at the edge of a small gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly in the dusk. He bought a bottle of water and sat on the curb, watching the sky turn shades of orange and purple. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a text from his dad. "You alright, kiddo? Made it to the next stop yet?" Ethan smiled faintly, his fingers hovering over the screen. He debated whether to tell his dad about the bikers, but he decided against it. Grant Callahan had enough on his plate, and Ethan knew he could handle himself. "How good it? Just taking a break. Love you." He sent the message and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The road ahead was long, but he felt lighter now, as though shedding the weight of the encounter had cleared his path. The next morning, Ethan woke up in a small roadside motel, the hum of passing cars outside lulling him awake. He stretched and packed his things, ready to continue his journey. As he stepped out of the motel, he froze. The bikers were there. Their bikes were parked in a line, and the gang stood awkwardly near the entrance, their usual swagger noticeably absent. Rocco was at the front, his leather jacket slung over one shoulder, his expression unreadable. Ethan sighed, adjusting the strap of his backpack. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Rocco stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We're here to apologize," he said, his voice quieter than Ethan had ever heard it. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Apologize?" "Yeah," Rocco said, glancing back at his crew. "We crossed a line yesterday. We shouldn't have treated you the way we did." Pete stepped forward, his weathered face filled with genuine remorse. "We didn't know who you were, kid. If we had..." "It shouldn't matter who I am," Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp. "You shouldn't treat anyone like that." Pete nodded, his head low. "You're right. And we're sorry." Ethan studied them for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the group. They looked different now, less like a gang of bullies and more like a group of men realizing the weight of their actions. He let out a slow breath, his stance relaxing slightly. "Apology accepted," he said finally. "But if I hear about you pulling this crap with anyone else, we'll have a different conversation?" Rocco nodded, his face serious. "You won't." "We'll make sure of it." Ethan gave them one last look before walking past them, his steps steady. The bikers watched him go, a mix of relief and respect on their faces. As Ethan disappeared down the road, Pete turned to Rocco. "Think we'll ever see him again?" "I hope not," Rocco said quietly. "But if we do, I'll make damn sure we're on the right side of things." As Ethan walked away, the sun climbed higher into the sky, the golden rays reflecting off the chrome of the bikers' motorcycles. He didn't look back, but he could feel their eyes on him until he disappeared over the horizon. With every step, he felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Standing up to people like that wasn't easy, but it had been necessary. Ethan pulled out his phone to check his route. The next town was about 12 miles away, a good half-day's walk if he kept his pace. He tucked the phone back into his pocket, adjusted his backpack, and kept moving. He couldn't help but replay the encounter in his mind, not with fear, but with a sense of quiet pride. He had stood his ground without losing control. His dad would have been proud. Back at the bikers' hangout, the gang returned to their hideout later that afternoon, a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town, its walls covered in graffiti and the faint smell of oil lingering in the air. The group was unusually quiet, their usual banter replaced by introspection. Rocco leaned against his bike, his face grim. He lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, breaking the silence, "that kid just gave us the kind of wake-up call we didn't know we needed." Pete nodded, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I've been riding with you for a long time, Rocco, and I've seen us do some stupid things. But this could have ended real bad." Rocco glared at him, but the usual fire in his eyes was gone. He knew Pete was right. "Yeah, well, it didn't. We apologized." Kid accepted. End of story. "But is it?" Tony piped up, his voice hesitant. "We've been living like this for years. Scaring people, throwing our weight around. What happens when the next Ethan comes along?" Rocco didn't answer right away. He crushed his cigarette under his boot and stared at the ground. The gang had been his family, his way of life, for over a decade. But for the first time, he wondered if it was enough. If it was right. "You think we should change?" Rocco finally asked, his voice quieter than usual. Pete looked at him, his expression serious. "Yeah, Rocco. I do. That kid showed more guts than any of us, and he didn't even have to throw a punch. Maybe it's time we start doing things differently." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Change wasn't something they were used to, but the encounter with Ethan had shaken them. It had made them question not just their actions but who they were. On the road, Ethan reached the next town by late afternoon. It was a small, dusty place with a single main street lined with diners, a gas station, and a motel. He grabbed a sandwich at a local cafe and sat outside, watching the town's slow rhythm. A few kids rode bikes down the street, their laughter filling the air. For a moment, Ethan let himself relax. As he ate, his phone buzzed. It was another message from his dad. "How's the journey going? Call me when you can." Ethan smiled. His dad always worried, even though he tried to hide it. He pulled up his contacts and hit the call button. "Hey, Dad," he said when Grant answered. "I'm good. Just stopped for a break." "Good to hear," Grant replied, his voice warm but sharp, the way it always was. "Everything all right? Through something you heard?" Ethan hesitated, debating whether to tell him about the bikers. "Yeah," he said finally. "Just a long walk." Grant didn't press, but Ethan could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. "All right, kiddo. Just remember what I taught you. Keep your head up, stay aware, and don't let anyone push you around." Ethan smiled. "I know, Dad. Love you. Love you too, son. Be safe." Ethan hung up and tucked his phone away. His dad didn't need to know every detail. He had handled the situation, and that was enough. A surprise encounter. 2 days later, as Ethan approached another stretch of road leading into the hills, he heard the rumble of motorcycles in the distance. His chest tightened, and he instinctively scanned for cover, but the bikers weren't riding toward him. They were parked at the side of the road, their bikes lined up neatly. And they weren't there to mock him. Rocco stepped forward as Ethan approached, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Behind him, the rest of the gang stood with their arms crossed, their expressions subdued. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, stopping a safe distance away. Rocco cleared his throat, his voice steady but humble. "We've been thinking about what you said, about the way we've been living." Ethan raised an eyebrow, unsure where this was going. "You were right," Rocco continued. "The way we treated you, and probably a lot of other people, it wasn't right. So we wanted to do something about it." Ethan crossed his arms. "And we're not just here to say sorry again," Rocco said. "We're here to prove it. We found a local shelter that needed some help. Repairs, donations, stuff like that. Figured we could use our time and resources to do something good for once." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. You volunteering?" Rocco nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah. It's not much, but it's a start." Pete stepped forward, his voice softer. "You showed us a better way, kid. We're just trying to follow through." Ethan studied them for a long moment, his gaze steady. He didn't fully trust them yet, but he could see the sincerity in their faces. They weren't the same cocky gang that had mocked him days ago. They were trying. "All right," Ethan said finally. "But if you're serious about this, it's going to take more than one good deed." "We know," Rocco said. "And we're ready." Ethan nodded, his stance relaxing. "Good. Then prove it." As he walked past them, heading toward the hills, the bikers watched him go. For the first time, they felt like they were moving in the right direction. Not just for Ethan, but for themselves. Over the next few weeks, Rocco and his gang threw themselves into their newfound mission. It started with small acts, helping fix up the local shelter, volunteering at a food drive, and even offering free mechanical work for people in the community. At first, their efforts were met with skepticism. The locals knew the gang's reputation and weren't quick to believe in their sudden change of heart. But as time went on, the bikers began to win people over. They showed up early, stayed late, and worked hard without expecting anything in return. Rocco, once a symbol of intimidation, became a quiet leader, using his influence to rally the gang for good rather than chaos. Pete took on the role of mediator, reaching out to organizations and explaining their intentions. He had a knack for talking to people, his grizzled demeanor softened by genuine sincerity. "We're not looking for praise," he would say. "We're just trying to make up for what we've done." Tony, the youngest member of the gang, found himself drawn to working with kids at a local community center. He taught them how to fix their bikes and even set up a workshop where they could tinker with old parts. The kids adored him, and for the first time, Tony felt like he had a purpose beyond the gang. Ethan's return. Ethan, meanwhile, had reached his destination, a small town nestled in the hills where he was visiting his uncle. He spent his days helping out at the family farm, enjoying the quiet life, but the encounter with the bikers lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't seen the last of them. 2 months later, as he made his way back home, Ethan passed through the town where he'd first encountered the gang. To his surprise, he saw Rocco and his crew outside the shelter, their bikes parked neatly to the side. They were carrying boxes of supplies into the building, their leather jackets swapped for plain work clothes. Ethan stopped in his tracks, watching them for a moment. He debated whether to approach, but before he could decide, Pete spotted him. "Hey kid," Pete called, waving him over. The rest of the gang turned, their faces lighting up with recognition. Ethan approached cautiously. "What's going on?" Rocco stepped forward, wiping his hands on his jeans. "We've been busy," he said simply. "Told you we'd prove it?" Ethan glanced at the shelter, then back at the gang. "This isn't what I expected." Rocco smirked. "Didn't expect it either. But it feels..." Tony jogged over, his face alight with excitement. "You should see the workshop we set up at the community center. The kids love it. They've been fixing up old bikes and making them their own. It's pretty cool." Ethan couldn't help but smile. "Sounds like you've been busy." "Busy's better than the alternative," Pete said, leaning against the shelter's wall. "And a lot more fulfilling." Ethan studied them, searching for any signs of insincerity, but he found none. They looked different now, not just in appearance but in the way they carried themselves. The arrogance was gone, replaced by humility and purpose. "I'll admit," Ethan said, "I didn't think you'd actually follow through." Rocco chuckled. "Neither did we. But you gave us a wake-up call. Sometimes that's all it takes." Ethan nodded, his respect for them growing. "I'm glad you're making a change. Keep it up." "We will," Rocco promised, his tone serious. "And if you're ever passing through, stop by. You've got friends here now." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then extended his hand. Rocco shook it firmly, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had all taken. The legacy of change. Months turned into years, and the gang's transformation became the talk of the region. They became known not as troublemakers but as protectors of the community. They organized charity rides, hosted events for underprivileged kids, and even started a program to help at-risk youth find purpose through mechanics and craftsmanship. Rocco, once feared and reviled, became a respected figure in the town. He often credited Ethan for setting them on the right path, though he rarely shared the full story. "Sometimes, you just need someone to hold up a mirror," he would say. Ethan, meanwhile, carried the lessons of that encounter with him wherever he went. He knew that standing up for what was right didn't always require strength or force. It required conviction, empathy, and the courage to believe that people could change. One final meeting. Years later, Ethan returned to the town as an adult, his father Grant joining him for the visit. As they walked through the main street, Ethan pointed out the changes: the renovated shelter, the thriving community center, and the garage where the bikers now ran a successful business. "Looks like they've done well for themselves," Grant said, his tone impressed. "They have," Ethan replied. "I wasn't sure they would, but they proved me wrong." As they approached the garage, Rocco stepped out, his hair now streaked with gray but his presence still commanding. He froze for a moment, then broke into a wide grin. "Well, if it isn't the kid who changed everything," Rocco said, walking over to greet them. Ethan smiled. "Just passing through. Thought I'd see how you're doing." "We're doing all right," Rocco said, shaking his hand. He glanced at Grant and extended his hand. "You must be his dad." Grant shook his hand firmly. "I've heard a lot about you." "Good things, I hope," Rocco said with a smirk. Grant's lips twitched into a small smile. "Depends on who you were then or who you are now." Rocco nodded, his expression serious. "We've worked hard to be better." "Hope that counts for something." "It does," Grant said. "And I respect that." As they parted ways, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The gang had come full circle, their redemption not just a story but a legacy. And as he and his father walked into the sunset, Ethan knew that even the smallest acts of courage could change the world. As Ethan and his father walked back toward their car, Grant's curiosity got the better of him. "So, you never told me the whole story about these guys," he said, glancing back at the garage where the bikers were still gathered. "What exactly happened between you and them?" Ethan chuckled softly. "It's a long story, Dad." "We've got time," Grant replied, his sharp gaze narrowing slightly. "And I'd like to know how my son managed to turn a gang of troublemakers into community leaders." Ethan hesitated, then began recounting the encounter, how the bikers had surrounded him, mocked him, and how he'd stood his ground. He left out the fear he'd felt in the moment, focusing instead on the way he'd remembered his father's lessons about courage and conviction. Grant listened intently, his expression unreadable as Ethan finished the story. "You didn't call me," Grant said finally, his tone more curious than accusatory. "I didn't need to," Ethan replied. "You taught me how to handle myself." A small smile tugged at Grant's lips. "That I did. And I have to say, you handled it better than most grown men would have." Ethan shrugged. "It wasn't easy, but I think it worked out for the best." Grant stopped walking and turned to face him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did more than just handle it, Ethan. You changed lives. That's not something everyone can do." Ethan met his father's gaze, feeling a surge of pride at the words. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." The gang's new mission. Back at the garage, Rocco watched Ethan and his father disappear down the street. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction, not just from seeing Ethan again, but from knowing they had earned his respect. "Hard to believe it's been years," Pete said, stepping up beside him. "Feels like yesterday we were a bunch of idiots riding around, thinking we owned the world." "We've come a long way," Rocco replied, his voice thoughtful. "And we've still got a lot to prove." Pete nodded, his expression serious. "So, what's next?" Rocco turned to the rest of the gang, who were gathered near the workbenches, chatting and laughing as they worked on a bike. He smiled, a rare warmth in his usually stoic demeanor. "We keep going," Rocco said. "We keep building, helping, and showing this town, and ourselves, that people can change. That we can be better." The gang nodded in agreement, their camaraderie stronger than ever. They had started as a group bound by rebellion and mischief, but now they were a family united by purpose and redemption. Ethan's legacy. As the years passed, Ethan's life continued to evolve. He graduated college, started a career, and carried the lessons from his encounter with the bikers into every aspect of his life. He became known for his calm demeanor and ability to bring out the best in people, even in the toughest of circumstances. Though he didn't stay in constant contact with the gang, he would occasionally hear updates from Pete or Rocco. They had expanded their community efforts, mentoring young people and organizing charity events. The garage had become a hub for the town, a place where people could gather, learn, and grow. One day, years later, Ethan received a package in the mail. Inside was a photo of the gang standing in front of the garage, smiling proudly. Attached was a note in Rocco's familiar handwriting. "To the kid who taught us what strength really means, thank you. You'll always have a place here. Ride safe." Ethan smiled as he read the note, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. He placed the photo on his desk, a reminder of the power of compassion and the impact of standing up for what's right. Final reflections. In the end, the story of Ethan and the bikers wasn't just about redemption. It was about transformation, courage, and the belief that even the hardest hearts could change. It was a reminder that strength wasn't about intimidation or power. It was about the quiet resolve to do the right thing, even in the face of fear. And as Ethan moved forward in his life, he carried that lesson with him, knowing that sometimes, all it took was one small act of bravery to change the world. Years later, Ethan found himself once again walking along a quiet road, his mind drifting back to that fateful encounter with the bikers. So much had changed since then. He was no longer the shy, uncertain teenager he had been. Life had pushed him to grow, to lead, and to carry forward the lessons of courage and conviction his father had instilled in him. This time, he wasn't walking alone. Beside him was his young niece, Lily, her small hand clutching his as they headed toward a festival in the same town where everything had happened. The event was organized by the gang-turned community leaders, who had since become an integral part of the town's culture. The annual Wheels for Good festival had grown into a massive celebration, raising funds for local charities and bringing the community together. As they approached the festival grounds, Ethan spotted the familiar rows of motorcycles gleaming under the sun. The smell of grilled food and the sound of live music filled the air, and children ran excitedly between the booths. It was hard to believe that this vibrant, welcoming event had been spearheaded by the same group of men who once laughed at him in the desert. "Uncle Ethan, look!" Lily exclaimed, pointing to a large banner that read, Inspiring change, one ride at a time. Ethan smiled. Pretty cool, huh? Do you know these guys? Lily asked, her wide eyes scanning the crowd. I do, Ethan said, his voice filled with pride. And they're some of the best people I know. Reunion at the festival. As they wove through the crowd, Ethan spotted Rocco near a stage, overseeing the event. His hair was almost entirely gray now, and his face bore the lines of a life well lived. Despite the years, his presence was as commanding as ever, though it was now tempered with warmth and humility. Rocco caught sight of Ethan and broke into a grin. Well, I'll be damned, he said, walking over and pulling Ethan into a firm handshake that turned into a quick hug. Look who decided to stop by. Couldn't miss it, Ethan replied. You've really outdone yourselves? Rocco chuckled, glancing around at the bustling festival. Yeah, it's come a long way. But it wouldn't have started without you. Ethan shook his head. That's all you, Rocco? You and the guys? Nah, Rocco said, his voice quiet. You planted the seed, kid. We just made sure it grew. Lily tugged at Ethan's sleeve, her curiosity piqued. Uncle Ethan, who's this? This, Ethan said, placing a hand on Rocco's shoulder, is my friend Rocco. He's one of the people who made all of this happen. Rocco crouched down to Lily's level, his weathered face softening as he smiled at her. Nice to meet you, Lily. Your uncle here is one brave guy, you know that? Lily nodded solemnly, as though absorbing the weight of Rocco's words. He's the best. Rocco laughed, standing back up. Smart kid. Must run in the family. A lasting impact. The festival was a resounding success, with the gang raising more money than ever before for local causes. As the sun set and the crowd began to thin, Ethan and Rocco sat on the tailgate of a truck, watching the lights twinkle across the fairgrounds. You've done something incredible here, Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence. Rocco nodded slowly. Feels good, you know? To give back. To build something instead of tearing things down. Ethan glanced at him, a faint smile on his lips. Do you ever think about the past? About how things could have gone differently? Every damn day, Rocco admitted. But I don't dwell on it. What's done is done. All we can do is move forward. Ethan nodded, his respect for Rocco deepening. You've come a long way. We all have, Rocco said, his voice carrying a quiet weight. And it all started with you, kid. The legacy lives on. As the festival came to a close, Ethan and Lily prepared to head home. Before they left, Pete caught up with them, handing Ethan a small envelope. What's this? Ethan asked. Just something we wanted you to have, Pete said with a grin. Open it later. Ethan slipped the envelope into his pocket, shaking Pete's hand before walking back to his car. Later that night, when he was back home, he opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, signed by every member of the gang. It detailed their gratitude for Ethan's courage that day and how it had set them on a path to redemption. At the bottom was a simple phrase, "Thank you for showing us a better way." Ethan folded the letter carefully, his heart full. He placed it beside the photo they had sent him years ago, a reminder of the profound impact one moment of courage could have. And as he turned out the light and settled into bed, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. The shy teenager he had once been was long gone, but the lessons he had learned and the lives he had touched would stay with him forever. As the years passed, the bikers' reputation grew beyond their town. What had started as local efforts to make amends blossomed into a movement that reached neighboring communities. They began organizing regional charity rides, raising money for schools, shelters, and hospitals. They called their groups the Iron Circle, a name that symbolized strength, resilience, and unity. Rocco and Pete became co-leaders, guiding their crew with a sense of purpose that inspired others. Younger bikers joined their ranks, not to wreak havoc but to contribute to something greater. They mentored at-risk youth, offering them not just skills and mechanics but a sense of belonging and direction. Their garage expanded into a full-fledged community center, complete with a workshop, a classroom, and a kitchen that served meals to anyone in need. It became a safe haven for those seeking help, a place where no one was judged for their past. Ethan's continuing influence. Though Ethan had moved on with his life, his impact on the gang remained a guiding force. They often spoke of the kids who had changed everything, using his story to inspire others. Whenever they faced challenges, they would ask themselves, what would Ethan do? One day, years later, Ethan received an invitation in the mail. It was from the Iron Circle, inviting him to their 10th anniversary celebration. The event promised to be a grand gathering of the community, complete with live music, food, and a tribute to the journey that had brought them all together. Ethan smiled as he read the invitation, feeling a swell of pride. He hadn't seen the gang in years, but he knew he couldn't miss this milestone: the anniversary celebration. When Ethan arrived at the event, he was greeted with cheers and hugs from the bikers. The gathering was massive, with hundreds of people in attendance, families, volunteers, and supporters who had been touched by the Iron Circle's work. Rocco took the stage as the crowd quieted, his voice carrying with the weight of years of leadership. 10 years ago, we were a bunch of guys with a bad reputation and no direction, he began. We thought strength was about how loud you could shout or how much trouble you could cause. But then we met someone who showed us that real strength comes from standing up for what's right. He gestured toward Ethan, who stood near the front of the crowd. Ethan Callahan didn't just stand up to us. He stood up for something bigger, for respect, for decency, and for the belief that people can change. He gave us a chance to prove that we're more than our mistakes. The crowd erupted into applause as Rocco continued. Ethan, this celebration wouldn't exist without you. So tonight we're dedicating this center to the lessons you taught us. From now on, this place will be known as the Callahan Community Garage. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the crowd cheered. He stepped onto the stage, overwhelmed by the recognition. I don't know what to say, he began, his voice shaky but sincere. You've all done so much more than I ever imagined. This isn't about me, it's about all of you. You took a hard road and turned it into something beautiful. I'm just honored to have been a small part of it. The applause was deafening as Ethan stepped down, his heart full. He spent the rest of the evening reconnecting with the gang, listening to their stories and seeing firsthand the lives they had touched. A legacy of change. By the time the celebration ended, Ethan knew that what he had started was far greater than he had ever realized. The Iron Circle had become more than a redemption story. It was a movement that proved people could rise above their past and create something meaningful. As Ethan drove home that night, the stars shining brightly above, he thought about the shy teenager he had once been. Back then, he never could have imagined the impact he would have on others. But now, he understood that even the smallest acts of courage could spark a transformation far greater than himself. And that was a legacy he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As the years continued to pass, the Iron Circle's influence spread far and wide. What began as a single group of bikers in a small town became a network of community hubs across the region. Each location followed the principles of humility, service, and redemption that Rocco, Pete, and the others had embraced. Their message was simple but profound. It's never too late to change, and it's never too late to do good. Ethan occasionally visited the original Callahan Community Garage, where he was always welcomed like family. He often brought his niece Lily, who adored hearing the stories of how the Iron Circle started. But on one particular visit, something caught Ethan by surprise. As he walked into the workshop, he saw a group of teenagers working on bikes under the guidance of Tony, who had grown into an excellent mentor. One of the teens looked up and recognized Ethan immediately. The boy's face lit up with excitement. "Are you the Ethan?" the boy asked, his voice filled with awe. Ethan chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. "I guess so. Depends on what you've heard." The boy grinned, his hands still smudged with grease. "They told us about you. How you stood up to them back in the day. How it all started because of you." Ethan felt a mix of pride and humility. "It wasn't just me," he said. "They're the ones who made the choice to change. I just gave them a push." The boy nodded, but the admiration in his eyes didn't fade. "Well, if you hadn't done that, none of this would be here. So, thanks." Ethan smiled and gave the boy a pat on the shoulder before turning to Tony. "Looks like you're doing a great job with them." Tony shrugged, his grin lopsided. "They're good kids. Just need someone to show them they matter." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with pride as he watched the next generation carry forward the values that had been born out of his encounter with the gang. Rocco's reflection. In the years that followed, Rocco stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the Iron Circle, passing the reins to Tony and a younger crew. But he remained a constant presence at the original garage, always ready to offer advice or share a story with anyone who needed it. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Rocco sat on the porch of the garage, watching the activity inside. Pete joined him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Hard to believe how far we've come," Pete said, handing Rocco a mug. Rocco nodded, a faint smile on his face. "Yeah. Feels like a lifetime ago we were riding around, thinking we owned the world." Pete chuckled. "We didn't own anything. Just left a trail of trouble wherever we went. And now?" Rocco asked, gesturing to the bustling garage. "Now we've got something real. Something that lasts?" Pete leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Think Ethan ever realized what he started?" Rocco smirked. "Kid's humble to a fault. But yeah, I think he knows. And I think he's proud of what we've built." They sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of laughter and tools clinking filling the air. For Rocco, this was peace, not the thrill of the open road or the fleeting power of intimidation, but the quiet satisfaction of a life rebuilt on purpose and redemption. Ethan's letter. One day, long after Ethan had moved on to new adventures, he received a letter in the mail. The envelope was worn, the handwriting familiar. It was from Rocco. "Ethan, I hope this letter finds you well. It's been a long time since we last saw each other, but I wanted you to know something. You changed our lives, kid. Not just mine, but all of ours. You didn't just teach us to be better, you taught us to believe in ourselves, to see that we could be more than our mistakes. And for that, I'll always be grateful. The garage is in good hands now. Tony and the new crew are doing incredible things, and the younger generation is picking up where we left off. You should see it, it's more than I ever dreamed it could be. I don't know where life will take you, but wherever you go, just remember this, you're part of something bigger than you'll ever know. And as long as the Iron Circle exists, so will your legacy. Ride safe, kid." Rocco. Ethan folded the letter carefully, his chest tight with emotion. He placed it in the same box where he kept the photo and earlier notes from the gang. It was a box filled with reminders of how one moment of courage had changed the course of so many lives, including his own. The enduring legacy. Years turned into decades, and the Iron Circle's influence continued to grow. The Callahan Community Garage became a symbol of transformation and hope, its story inspiring countless others to believe in the power of redemption. Ethan, now older and wiser, often looked back on that day in the desert with a mix of amazement and gratitude. What had begun as a terrifying encounter had blossomed into something far greater than he ever could have imagined. And as he told the story to his own children and grandchildren, he always ended with the same words: "Sometimes, all it takes is a little courage to change the world."